What's up, Lions of Liberty fans? You can now support this show on Patreon and get exclusive access to bonus audio and video content, including Conspiracy Corner, Degenerate Gamblers, bonus segments with guests, and so much more. Head on over to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here's your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Claire.
What's up, kitty cats, and welcome back to the original, the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast that I have been doing for close to 5 years now. And we're going to get back on format this week a little bit after 3 weeks of huge mega shows from the Libertarian National Convention in New Orleans, which was just a magical, liberty-filled time. But I'm going to have a great guest for you today, Dr. Eric Larson. We're going to talk a little bit about Ron Paul. Not sure if you guys have ever heard me mention that name before. And about medical cartels. So very interesting stuff coming your way in this episode, which is episode number 358 of the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast. That means you can find today's show notes over at lionsofliberty.com/358. And I want you guys to stay tuned a little bit later in the show where I'm going to give you some information about an anti-war country song by a listener of this program named Zach Kincaid. And you can get a free download of that song if you just tune in to this program for a little bit longer. And lastly, I do want to make this announcement at the top of the show here today because I mentioned it at the end of last week's program, but it is official now. We will be launching a new, very short-term spin-off program called Candidates of Liberty, in which we'll be featuring very short interviews with different libertarian candidates all around the country. And we really want to do something to help the libertarian candidates since I had met so many great ones this weekend, so many of whom had reached out asking for interviews, and there was just no way we could accommodate everybody or even a small portion of the people who wanted to get interviewed and spread the word about their campaign. So we decided to do something extra to go even more out of our way and provide a new show for you. So that's going to be starting sometime in mid-August, and it is called Candidates of Liberty. So look forward to that coming down the pipeline. If you appreciate the work we do, all the extra work we are doing for this show, please do consider joining the Lions of Liberty Pride and becoming a supporter of ours on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to all sorts of bonus content, Conspiracy Corner, Degenerate Gamblers, bonus segments with guests, bonus libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor shows, so much more. I can't even describe it all. Plus, we are uploading the whole archive from the last year and a half or so. So there's just tons of content coming up there right now. And if you want to toss us a few bucks, it would be greatly appreciated. That enables us to do stuff like attend the Libertarian National Convention, like attend PorcFest, and bring you all sorts of programming from those events. And it enables us to do more shows like what we're doing with Candidates of Liberty upcoming. So please do check us out, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. But enough promotion, folks. Let's get to the show. All right, here with me today is an assistant clinical professor of anesthesiology at Michigan State University's College of Human Medicine. He is the chair of the Kent County Medical Society and the host of the Paradox podcast. That's docs with a C as in doctors, not paradox, not the other paradox. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Eric Larson. Dr. Larson, are you ready to roar?
I am, but I'm a long-suffering Lions fan. If you're from Michigan, so our roars are more whimper nowadays, and so it's kind of it is sort of the meow right now.
So there's a lot of worlds kind of coming together here, right? There's the libertarian Lions and your own Lions.
Right. My Lions have not won a playoff. They've only won one playoff game in my lifetime, which is pretty sad because I'm getting kind of old up there in age.
All right, well, we'll try not to think about them too much during our time together here. We don't want to bring the mood down. But, Dr. Larson, I've seen you around a little bit. I know you recently started your podcast, and you're really getting out there and talking about libertarian ideas, but also talking about them kind of through the perspective of being a professional doctor, which I think is always great because libertarians love to talk about all their ideas about how things should be, but you often get criticisms like, oh, what do you know? You're not a fill in the blank. You're not a doctor. So it's always good on to bring, to actually speak to an actual doctor who I can say, yes, well, this guy is, so listen to him. So why don't we get started just talking a little bit about how you first became interested in libertarian ideas and how you got started in the medical field. I don't know which of those came first, so I'll let you kind of just start things off and take it from wherever it makes the most sense.
Well, I think as a kid growing up in high school, even was when I started to become politically aware. And so at that point, like sort of a traditional Republican family, I suppose I came from, but not, there certainly wasn't any deep philosophical underlinings of sort of what, any principles that you sort of have aside from taxes are kind of annoying and the government doesn't do things very well.
Right.
So that was sort of the extent of it, right? And I went to college. I went to University of Michigan as an undergrad got my bachelor's in nuclear engineering. Anyway, when I was there, I probably had libertarian leanings, but no, I think I read Atlas Shrugged in high school, but I'm not sure. Maybe like a junior or senior year. I was a freshman, and Leonard Peikoff came to give a talk on buying American is un-American. And so I thought, well, I'm at college. I'm supposed to hear, find all these different, challenge myself with different ideas. So I went to the talk, and it made a lot of sense, that actually the comparative advantages and all sorts of the economics, that a nationalistic sort of view of the world is not the right way. So anyway,
previously as a Republican, did you just kind of have that sort of nationalist idea that, I got to buy American products, I got to buy Budweisers, I got to buy Toyotas because that's the right thing to do because we're all Americans and we're all in this together?
Probably. I don't think it was very sophisticated, thinking as far as
right.
What I was, I didn't have a big worldview at the time. When I was a junior, I think in high school, that's when the first Gulf War launched. So that was certainly at that point, I was maybe 16, 17. And so then the thought of a draft is a possibility. I mean, that was the first major war since Vietnam. I mean, obviously it was over in 3 seconds, but there was that concern was there and the thought was there. And so just sort of the thoughts of getting drafted, and if that's the right sort of thing, if the government has the power and the right to tell you what to do as far as, go get yourself killed or whatever. Right. And so then at college was kind of a natural extension when I saw the libertarianism. And then I got involved the paper at Michigan called the Michigan Review, which was sort of the alternative publication and the non-daily paper that was a conservative bent, sort of framed around the National Review, that they had a number of these review sort of newspapers all over the country, different colleges. Ours was very libertarian, and there were some deeper libertarian thinkers who was there. And at that time, that was the 90s, libertarianism was really didn't really exist. I mean, in some ways it existed, but it was very, very fringish, right? If you say
some would say it doesn't exist now,
well, but it has completely transformed since because when I would tell people I'm libertarian, they'd never heard the term. I mean, I think it's right. Now people at least have heard it. They may not know what it means, but they certainly didn't have any clue what you're talking about.
They might have wild, mischaracterized ideas about what that is, but at least they have heard of it. And that's something.
And that is a tremendous leap forward from what it was. I mean, then you really were a piece of tumbleweed blowing around in the desert because there was no one else you'd run into pretty much that was a libertarian. So anyway, I worked at that paper. I learned about a little bit more. I actually dabbled in objectivism for a little bit, kind of got a little tired of the dogmatic sort of portion of objectivism. And then I got involved in the Libertarian Party of Washtenaw County, which is the county, which is, I mean, you just want to talk about small. That's like, meets a small library. You can meet the entire party. But met some really neat people, got a little better feeling for what libertarianism was. And my friend, who actually now is finishing his third term in the Michigan State Legislature, we went to the Libertarian Presidential Convention in 1996, which was Harry Brown. And we got in as delegates, which, all you had to do was show up and you pretty much became a delegate to the party.
That's pretty much true now because
yes.
I became a delegate to this last convention pretty much by accident. I was already planning to go there to cover it for the podcast and to do interviews. And, a couple weeks beforehand, Angela McCardle, who's the LA County chair out here, just said, hey, is anybody else, can anybody make it there? Can anybody be a delegate? And I'm a member of the party and I was going to be there. So I said, well, I mean, I'm going to be there.
Yeah.
So if you need to make me a delegate, go for it. So this is one thing. And we talked a little bit before the show about my appearance on the Jason Stapleton program, which by the time people hear this will have been a week or two ago. But, that was the one thing that I brought up to him is that sometimes all it takes is literally just showing up to get involved in something and to start making an impact.
No question. And in many ways, like I run the Kent County Medical Society. It's just a 1-year term here, which is obviously in Kent County, Michigan, Grand Rapids. But that was very much any volunteers, everyone takes a step back and you're the one left standing there, right? It's the same thing in the Libertarian Party. Like if you're willing to to show up and do something, there's plenty to do. And there's probably far more than you could ever accomplish. And so, it's easy to have an impact within the party. How great that impact is, that's where the debate lies, I suppose, ultimately. So anyway, then after that, I went to medical school at the University of Iowa. I was there for 8 years, met my wife. She's a pediatrician. So we met third year medical school. I did my training in anesthesiology. And so after 8 years in Iowa City, I moved back to Michigan. I grew up in Lansing here, and I settled in private practice here in Grand Rapids in 2004. I didn't do any sort of libertarian activity, or very minimal, while I was in Iowa, just because it's medical school and residency. You don't have time to, do much aside from just read.
Do anything.
I mean,
except study,
right. I mean, you have Reason magazine, and occasionally I look at, Reason websites and things like that. But I mean, that was kind of the extent of my contact with libertarians.
It was before you had so many great libertarian podcasts out there that you could go and listen to.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I didn't know what a podcast was until about 4 years ago.
I don't think most people did.
I mean, now it's like a thing. Now, if I tell people I do a podcast, they're like, oh, that's pretty cool. They actually know what it is. Most people, I mean,
it's like the word libertarian. Now they've at least heard of a podcast, even if they don't know how it is or how to listen to it.
Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of surgeons and nurses I show how to actually load do you have an iPhone? I'll show you. It's pretty easy, and I can download it from. Right. I don't know if they end up listening to it, but
they can rewire somone's brain, but they aren't quite sure how to subscribe to a podcast.
Yeah, you have to be very good at what you do.
Yes.
You don't have to,
no matter what that
right.
is.
As long as you're the best at that, that's all that matters. Whether you can tie your shoes or well, they just buy some Velcro shoes, right? Or whatever. So anyway, I came here to Michigan in 2004, and then I got involved because I had a little more time. My family was very smaller and younger at that time. And so I got involved in the Libertarian Party here locally. And I ended up being chair of the West Michigan Libertarian Party for, I don't know, a year or two. I can't remember exactly when, 2007 or something, 6 or so. And you sort of became disillusioned with the party and just, its ineffectiveness. And anyway, it was just, a lot of it was you're running candidates, but you're not running effective candidates. You're just struggling to, is it important to have candidates? There's all those debates you have, right? Whether it's the educational component, whether it's a political component. Right. I think, my thinking that has changed now as far as what is probably the most important if you want to, push the message and the movement. But anyway, at that time, it just didn't seem like, you kind of spinning your wheels. And then,
well, I can't let that go. I got to dig in a little more here. What was your sort of idea at the time, and how has that changed?
Well, my idea at the time was that initially was that we need to run candidates. We need to have a third option for people. I mean, they're, Constitution Party, Green Party, but fundamentally, when you look for a different philosophical approach to government, it was important to have a real choice, right? I mean, the Democrats and Republicans are very similar in many ways as far as, they're arguing about things. And they use state solutions for, most things. And so anyway, I thought it was important to have that other party. I became disillusioned because I just didn't see it moving the needle. I talked to people I still didn't know. I ran for statewide office twice, actually. I was one year, I think it was 2006, I was a top vote-getter for the state party in the state for running for college, the regent position at the University of Michigan. Doesn't mean much. I think there are just a lot of people who seem to know Eric Larson's, and that's my guess of how I was the most successful. Then what happened was 2007. And we all know what happened in 2007 if you got any sort of, and so I was, you want me to go into my Ron Paul story? I'm happy to.
Absolutely. I've done over 350 podcasts, and I would say probably at least 250 of them include a Ron Paul story from somebody.
Yeah,
so
right.
We can always use more.
So I'll tell you my Ron Paul story. I'll give you an extended story too. So one day I was down and I can say, honestly, I've watched C-SPAN, like just truly watched it maybe twice in my life when I didn't know something. I have no idea how I randomly turned on, but I turned on C-SPAN. And it was right after this, I think in February of 2007, maybe March or January. And Ron Paul was giving a floor speech about, gold standard and his usual sort of, his stump speech, but he's giving on the House floor. And so I was listening to that, and I thought, wow, this guy's pretty cool and pretty good. I like what he has to say, and he sounds pretty libertarian. He's a Republican. And then I remembered vaguely, or I looked it up or something, that he had run for president in the Libertarian Party in like 1984, I think, or something, or 88 maybe.
88, yeah.
Anyway, so I thought I'll just follow this guy, and I like him, so he's guaranteed to finish last, and he's guaranteed to garner no support, like maybe 0.01% of the campaign will be short and it'll be quick and it'll be very small. And so at that time, I mean, it's only been 11 years, but there's obviously no coverage from the mainstream media for the most part for his campaign. And they had much better stranglehold on information at that time. But there were all these YouTube is a new thing, right? And so you could watch these videos, these supporters would put up what he was doing. And so I got real excited about his campaign. I liked what he was saying. I liked the fact that I saw people getting excited about this. I mean, he had students at the University of Michigan, which is, it's not the most left-wing campus in the university, in a public university in the country, but it's probably top 10 or so. I mean, it's like, UW-Madison or Berkeley. And there are students chanting "End the Fed." I mean, that's totally insane.
I believe that's where like the "End the Fed" chant started. The first one that kind of spontaneously began when he was just up there talking about the Federal Reserve, and it was Michigan State of all places where spontaneously this "End the Fed" chant just started going. And I remember I was seeing the video of it and just seeing kind of the look of shock, amazement, and joy on his face all at once. Just, I think, all those emotions coming together of this thing that he'd been talking about for 30 years that no one hardly paid any attention to. And here he is at the University of Michigan with an "End the Fed" chant that just spontaneously began. So that must have been it probably gave you chills just watching it and seeing it. I mean, I imagine if you're actually Dr. Paul.
And right now, just talking about this, I got sort of like the chills, you kind of feel like right. kind of hair standing in because it was like a magical moment, really. But what happened before that was even kind of stranger for me. So my church, we had two pastors. We had a pastor Paul, and we had a pastor David. The main pastor is Pastor Paul Karpinski. The other one was he was a retired guy who was like from Southeast Michigan. So I didn't think much of it. And then that's sort of a side note. And then we were going to all the presidential candidates were gathering at Mackinac Island, which is an island in the Lake Huron in northern Michigan. Beautiful island. If you've not been there, highly recommend. It's a great vacation place. They have only horses allowed on the island. It's just kind of quaint and neat. So the Republicans every off election year have a political conference, and then they were having a bunch of all the candidates were basically going to show up because that time they're like 10 or something like that. With Fred Thompson, Giuliani, and all these guys. And so my wife and I we contribute. There was Ron Paul had a fundraiser there on the island, and so we decided to go to the conference. We decided to go to the fundraiser, and because our friends, we just thought it'd be kind of fun. And so then we max donated to that special event. Well, it turns out if you're a max donor to a Ron Paul campaign event in 2007, you're the max donor to the Ron Paul campaign event in 2007, right? Yeah.
You're expecting to be at the huge table with all the VIPs, but you're the VIP, right. It turns out.
So what's really interesting is as we're packing up to go and drive up, it's like a 3-hour trip, our friend calls us and said, "Hey, do you know that Ron Paul's brother is your pastor?" I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, Pastor David. Pastor David Paul is his brother. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. I think so. And you guys like Ron Paul, right?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, but what are the odds that could happen? There's no way." So we drive up to the conference. And we're there, and he gives a breakfast speech the day, one of the mornings. And I turned to my wife and said, "There is no question that is our pastor's brother." Because, they have different accents because I think Ron spent most of the time in Texas, and his brother was in Pennsylvania, Michigan. But like mannerisms, how that sort of siblings have sort of similar things. The way they hold the lectern and talk is that like there is, little question that they are related. So we actually hop on our bikes. We ride down to the hotel where they're having the fundraiser right afterwards. We're the first ones there, and also we're the only max donors. So we get in, and we're waiting, and Ron Paul arrives, and I've got 15 minutes of Ron Paul all by myself with my wife. So we're talking to him for a bit. I said, "I'm pretty sure your brother is our pastor." And he said, "Oh, David, is he down?" Yeah, because he happened to be, he and his wife were on a trip to Italy. So we're like, "Oh, yeah." And so we talked for a while, and of course, I've got 15 minutes all alone with Ron Paul. What do I talk about? Do I talk about economics? Do I talk about gold standard? No, I talk about cesarean sections and sort of what, and medicine, and not like Obamacare, but sort of like, just kind of what do you do for C-sections and stuff. And so we just talked about that kind of stuff. Later, all the flood people come in, they talk. So my wife doesn't say a word. She's just standing next to me the whole time. So we go back from the conference, get back to church, and I go up to the next week. The pastor comes back from vacation. I said, "Pastor David, do you know that I ran into your brother?" And he was wondering where you were. He's like, "Oh, Ron was there. Yeah, great." And yeah, he said he met this really nice blonde woman from my church. I said, oh, well, I mean, he met a couple of us, right? He just mentioned her. He didn't say anything else. So
he didn't mention a man there with her at all.
No, the guy who was talking to him. Clearly, I wasn't very interested in talking about C-sections, right? So, so what happened then is his brother, of course, he was about, I think, 3 or 4 years older than Ron. And he had, no dial-up, right? I mean, this is, again, hard for people to believe in 2007. So he had really no internet access. And so the campaign, the only way to follow it is, of course, through the internet, through YouTube, and, the money bombs and all this crazy stuff that was happening.
You weren't going to tune into Fox News or CNN and see anything about the Ron Paul campaign.
No, and the money bombs and where he raised all that money suddenly. I mean, we knew about this happening. He said, yeah, I talked to Ron. He said, there's going to be this thing happening. I said, yeah, no, I know all about it. And so I would give him updates and say, oh, we saw this and that. And there's a speech he gave here or whatever. And so we sort of had we had developed a really neat relationship with he and his wife, who are, he's a retired pastor from Southeast Michigan, who just came in to help out at our church. He just moved out to this side of the state. And so anyway, the campaign was over. We invited he and his wife to the party. And so during that whole time in 2007, we had meetup groups, because that was the way you sort of got together and sort of ran the Paul campaign, because there was no Ron Paul campaign. Essentially, they had some.
No, it's just whoever shows up to whatever,
right?
to meet up, so, that sort of thing.
You can't get a sign. You could get some. You had to order your own like bills, like the handbills that you'd hand out and stuff. So we would order stuff, and there were a bunch of us in town. I was like the publicity coordinator or something like that. So at that point, then I started showing up at Republican Party meetings, which were, because that was John McCain at that time. Pretty much, he was the front runner. And there was nobody in the Republican. I mean, you go to the county meetings, and there was like 3 people. And this is one of the largest county parties in the country. There was no grassroots support for the candidates at that time. There's 3 regular Republican people, and there were like 20 of us Ron Paul people in the room, not trying to take over, just trying to get involved and try and help. So we set up the tea parties, the initial tea party that happened after Obama got elected, because we were the ones who were around. But anyway, so then after the election was over, I was during the campaign before the January primary in Michigan, I looked up for all the FEC donors to Ron Paul, and of course there aren't that many, so it's not hard to track them down in our area zip codes. And one of them I noticed was a guy named Justin Amash. So I thought, oh, well, this guy, I don't know. I contacted all the people who were, and I never got a hold of him. But then I saw that he was running for state house, and he lives 3 miles from my house. So I saw he was running for state house, and so I reached out to him and said, I saw you're a Ron Paul supporter. Would you like to meet sometime? And he said, sure. We met. And I remember coming back to talk to Marcy. And again, at this point, I was probably, you consider a Libertarian Party member. And I said to my wife, Marcy, said, if this guy is half as good as he was when we talked, then I'm all into the Republican Party as long as he's in, because he can transform this party. I mean, he's radically different than the typical Republican. And, but fortunately for me, he won't win, because people I support never win, right? Lo and behold, he beat the competition. He beat he beat the established candidates pretty handily, and did amazing things. He was even more amazing in the House and actually in office than he was with posting things on Facebook and being the only one voting against things. He'd tell me stories of that. So we became very close friends, and we've been good friends ever since. And so that's how I got to know him. And the neat thing about later that summer is the Paul brothers would have family reunions the Paul family had a family reunion every year, and they would rotate it between all the 5 brothers. There are 5 of them, 2 in Texas, and then North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And so in 2009, I guess it was here in Michigan. And so my pastor said, hey, do you want to come to my family reunion? I think my brother's going to be there and all that. So I said, sure. He said, so Rand wasn't there because Rand was running for Senate at the time. So I didn't get to meet Rand, but I sat down with a dozen people, all the Paul brothers, and just had corn on the cob and hot dogs, and just sat around and hung out with them.
You're part of the family now. I
mean, it was a very blessed experience. It was really neat. And, Ron's like, you need to run for office at some point. And so it was actually kind of funny because he has the one brother who's very liberal, who is a Presbyterian pastor, I think, or anyway. And they were so Ron's going about how bad Obamacare would be if it got passed and those sorts of things. So I had a really unique insight into sort of the movement and the sort of the gist of all this story is that without a doubt, the libertarianism as a movement, as a philosophy, moved farther in that campaign because there's a presidential campaign. And in the United States, you can run for any office and people just don't care about it because most large issues that people talk about where they actually are paying it most attention is going to be a presidential campaign. And every other campaign doesn't really matter. And I think, not to say people shouldn't run for those offices. I mean, it's super important, right? But if you want to move a philosophy, if you want a movement to start, you have to have a strong presidential campaign in this country. I mean, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but I think in this country, having the right candidate with the right message is a huge for your movement. If you have a lousy candidate or a mediocre message, like I've been to the convention with Bob Barr, or he's not exciting. He got some votes, whatever, but it didn't change the conversation. And Ron Paul did, and right. I'm not exactly sure how it all happened. We'd always talked about, was it YouTube? Was it the fact they kept him out? Was it? But I think it's just something being different and being consistent and being in those debates. Those are very important. But having a message that resonates. And that's different, that people want different. And I think you saw the same thing in the Donald Trump campaign. And what I think you also see is that presidential candidate becomes your de facto leader philosophically and ideologically for your party. And you've seen that with Trump, where you see a Republican Party that has very much changed in how it views free trade and how it views a lot of things.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's essentially without a philosophy at this point. The philosophy is Trump, which is basically a non-philosophy. It's a philosophy of whatever I think will work. And in some cases that might end up being good. In some cases that might end up being bad. But without a governing philosophy to guide the whole thing, it's very dangerous territory, I think. But I do see, and this is not the direction we were necessarily going to go on the show, but I want to keep going on it because it's all good stuff. That's what I like about, we had talked before. I'm like, well, what's our plan here? Well, I don't like a plan. I like to see where it goes. So let's keep seeing where it goes. So that's the interesting thing about it is like without an overriding philosophy governing the Republican Party, I think you're going to see a lot of Republicans that become even more disaffected. And of course, they're probably going to end up defaulting to voting for Donald Trump, as most Republicans do, as most Republicans will always end up supporting the ticket out of fear of the other. And similarly, the Democrats will probably end up supporting whoever the Democrats put up out of fear of Trump. But I still do think there is a golden opportunity that may be very similar to the one that we could have had in 2016 for libertarians to be another voice and to provide sort of a third way, another direction to at least get some attention. Whether or not they actually achieve an electoral success, I think that's a bit of a long shot. But I'm curious, just having this conversation with you about, how you saw the ineffectiveness of libertarian campaigns on the small scale locally, and then how effective Ron Paul with a national platform was able to be just to inspire people and get them interested in the ideas and to sort of change that conversation altogether. Do you have a concept of like what sort of qualities? I'm not going to ask you for a person, but what sort of qualities that a Libertarian Party presidential candidate could have, considering the current state of affairs coming up in 2020? Like, what sort of messaging would you want to see from an LP candidate?
I think if you're a Libertarian candidate, I think you focus on just one or two or three issues, and I listened to Tom Wood's speech when he was talking about foreign policy, and I think he was the Federal Reserve. I think those are, I think the Federal Reserve, I know people were chanting "End the Fed" on the campus. I think foreign policy is the one wedge issue that you can differentiate yourself between the two major parties. And I think in that way, I think that is the issue that you can convince liberals that if you're against warfare and, generally poor people dying in wars, you need to oppose a strong state for that reason. There are things that the state can accomplish. Maybe we can think about other ways we can accomplish the same things, whether it's your voluntary, organizations or charities. And for the Republicans, I think it's a little bit easier sell in some ways because you say, we're not going to be a policeman of the world. There's no reason we should be funding, basically to provide the defense services for the rest of the world. And if you think that government waste is bad, the Pentagon's probably it's the wrong department to hold up as a showcase for wise government spending. And you even look at people who are in the military, and by and large, they are not fans of the way the military runs. because they see the tremendous amounts of waste in, personnel and equipment, and we spend every dime we got, so we get some more. We don't want stuff, and they still bring it for us or whatever.
Sure. It's amazing how many people I've spoken to over the years that have come into libertarian ideas because they were in the military and because they saw a lot of the things going on that they didn't agree with and started to realize that the mission wasn't necessarily the one that they were sold on when they first signed up. And then to hear someone like Ron Paul point that truth out to them and point out something they're already thinking, I think that's when, people really have a light bulb that goes off that say, wait a minute, I've already been thinking what this guy is now boldly stating out here. So that's the kind of thing that really can get people excited and get them to take something that was already in their mind and then actually begin to act on it and speak out about it themselves.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is I think it's real important that I think the Libertarian Party is not at risk of having, if they have a bad candidate, of harming the party significantly. I think their risk is that it's a missed opportunity. So I think it's not like a large established party like the Republican Democratic Party where they have a really bad candidate and you could significantly set them back for a while. I think it's just an opportunity. And I think I'm more convinced, especially after watching what happened to Ron Paul. I mean, I know it didn't pan out the way people wanted it to, but I think there's a significant opportunity, and it's going to be there as long as there's ballot access for the LP. So I think, if the LP doesn't get a good candidate in 2020, if they get a good one in 2024, it's fine too. I mean, you never know what the other party's going to have, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to have more libertarian positions. They're not going to co-opt them. So I think that opportunity is going to be there for the LP for whenever they decide to pick the right person. And I'm not going to comment on the internal workings or machinations of the party.
Oh yeah, we don't need to go into all that. That's another 3-hour conversation. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest that's probably is the biggest thing. It's an opportunity that there's very little downside. The worst case, the party just doesn't grow that much more. But there's a lot of upside. So that's what's potentially exciting about it is there's a lot of upside, and that's why I hope that there can just be someone who's very bold, someone who can get a lot of attention, and hopefully pounding on a lot of those same things, a lot of the big issues that we are against. Anti-war, anti-Federal Reserve, against ending the war on drugs, the really big issues that really not only are the heart of the philosophy, but also really truly set us apart from the actions of the Democrats and Republicans.
It doesn't matter at all who's the president. It's the money we lost and the lives we spent. It's time to bring the troops back home. We can't keep going down this road. We don't want to fight no more.
All right, guys, and that was an excerpt from the song No More by Zach Kincaid, because the United States has been at war for my entire adult life. We have wasted over $250 million every single day, lost 7,000 troops to battle, and we're losing 20 veterans a day to suicide. This issue is what inspired me to become a libertarian, and now it is time to say no more. Once upon a time, in my parents' generation, the message of peace defined a generation of music. Yet somehow, 17 years of fighting has not seemed to inspire this generation. And right now, the ideas of liberty are growing because of podcasts like this one, and now you can help spread the message of peace and liberty through a song. Zach Kincaid is a fan of the show. He's a songwriter from Northern California who just released a brand new album, which includes this song, No More, inspired by countless conversations with veterans of this terrible and unnecessary conflict. Listeners of Lions of Liberty can get a free acoustic download of the song over at rotgutcountry.com/roar. Go ahead and visit it, download the song, buy the album, and follow Zach Kincaid and his voice like a well drink in a dive bar. You can find out more about Zach by heading over to Rotgut Country, that's ROTGUT country.com, and across social media at Rotgut Country. We have some other stuff to get into here, so why don't we talk a little bit about, obviously you're a doctor, you've been dealing with the medical field, you have a whole podcast about this. Why don't we actually start talking about why you started the Paradox podcast? Again, that's Paradocs, not with an X. So the Paradox podcast, what inspired you to do all that? You've had some pretty interesting, very libertarian guests on so far.
Yeah, I have. So I guess it started because I listen to podcasts, right? So I think that's probably how most people start in podcasts. They're like, hey, I can do this. And in medicine,
that's what happened to me.
You don't have an option to create much in medicine. Take care of people, but you don't. There's no artistic sort of stuff that you do. Now I have very little, in fact, I'd probably say almost negative artistic talent. I have no musical talent, so I can talk. And so I thought, hey, I could probably do a podcast. And I got inspired listening to Jason Stapleton, certainly talking about, side hustles and things like that. I don't really need extra stream of income. But I thought that that's probably something I could do. I think I have a different perspective in the fact that I've actually in the trenches of medicine. So when people are talking about the Affordable Care Act, or they're talking about drug shortages or physician suicide, I mean, I have a different insight, and I have more credibility, and certainly I have a better feel for how it's all shaking out, and sort of how those things can be addressed, and sort of maybe a better idea of the root problem. So that's why I decided to start the podcast. I thought I had a good 4 or 5 episodes of content, and I just am actually publishing 14 tonight. So I just keep getting more. I don't know if you have this problem too, but I think just when I think I'm running out of people to talk about and things to talk about, I have someone contact me or send me a book or something. I'm like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. And so, and it's not always, and it's not a libertarian show in the sense that I don't ever talk about libertarianism. I think in my Patreon page, it says that I'm a libertarian, but that's pretty much like the only places anywhere.
It's just a descriptor of you, but it's not the focus of the show in the marketing sense.
Right. Because I think, it's a pragmatic utilitarian sort of focus on stuff, but ultimately when you look at the problems in medicine, most of them focus from the fact that there's far too much state control or intervention or regulations. And so how do you tackle those problems, and how do you find solutions? And so, I think most of the solutions rest in relying on patients and physicians and to try and solve them themselves. And generally lots of the problems are caused by people who get in between them. And, whether that's government payers, insurance companies, whatever. And so that's what we talk about.
So let's dig into that a little bit more. What are some of the biggest ways that the state intervenes in that relationship between the doctor and the patient that sort of distorts the market, distorts that entire function that really in an ideal society would really just be mostly between that doctor and that patient? But for some reason, there's all this other stuff that goes on in between.
Right. And I mean, the stuff in between is always the stuff that people feel. And that's what causes the biggest problems. I mean, the obvious things to talk about is the third party payer system where, I go into a grocery store, I buy a steak, I walk out of the store, I'm provided good steak, and, the store has every incentive to provide me the right steak and to provide a price that's reasonable. I know how much money I've got and how much money I have to spend. And, I can figure out, how much, depending on what quality, if I'm just feeding the kids, they don't care what, I can do ground beef versus if I'm just feeding my wife and we have something nicer. In medicine, it's not like that. In medicine, it's entirely different, right? So in medicine, I don't care. I walk in, I don't ever pay anything. And so as a consumer, I don't care what I get. I'm also, and for that reason, I'm less, I pay less attention, since I'm not paying attention to price, which gives you a sense of scarcity. I don't pay any attention to the other things that I should, like, what I could do to prevent me having to go in and buy steak every day. Maybe I should buy a refrigerator, right? Or something like that, right? And so I should take care of myself so I don't have to use the services much. For the same reason, the person who's selling the things, the physician or the surgery service or the hospital or whatever, they have no incentive to control the cost because, of course, there's no price point. There's no one discerning, how much they're spending. What I've really learned in the show, which has been I've learned a lot in the show. And so I would highly recommend people go back, and there are a lot of really good episodes because I learned a lot and I'm in the field, but I learned that, for instance, insurance companies, they have no incentive to keep costs down, which was always the thing that I had trouble understanding why an insurance company would be okay with the hospital continuing to jack up their prices, every year. And then with healthcare inflation, which far outpaces anything, I think, maybe outside of higher education.
Why are insurance companies okay with that? Because on the basic logic of it, and through how most of us think of insurance companies, most of them think of, these insurance companies, they just don't want to pay. They want to save money. They want to not pay out. So why would those two things don't seem to really jive? They don't want to pay out, but they're okay with the hospitals jacking up their rates. So what's the disconnect there?
So it's one that obviously involves the government. And with so many things in medicine, there are so many other factors that it's hard to always say, well, this is one thing. Like you can say, well, this is one law for passing a gun ban that, this is why this person have a gun or something. It's not like that in medicine. So if you don't have something, there's usually 20 things that affected it. And some of them are government related. Some are just market related that are in response to distortions caused by a government intervention. So when it comes to insurance, well, insurances are regulated generally at the state level. but they're also regulated in some of on the federal level by requirements for what insurance has to offer, or, like no, they have to accept all pre-existing conditions, or they have to insure you till age 26. So you're married, you have a kid, and your parents are paying for your kid and the delivery. I mean, weird stuff like this, right? And so the more provisions and the more regulations there are, it obviously makes the market smaller because the small players can't play. They can't pay to participate. And so from a regulatory standpoint, you've got rid of all the small players. And so from a competitive standpoint, now you have less people who are in the market who can compete. And so when you only have a few people in the market, they are competing on how much they spend. And so they have every incentive to not spend money. But they are, when you get your bill, it says, you get that large paper that comes with it. This is not the bill. This is the explanation of benefits, right? Everyone's gotten that if they've gone to the hospital. It was a $23,000 hospital bill. We saved you $18,500. Your copay is covered, and you only have to, you owe $750 or whatever, right?
Suddenly it sounds like a great deal somehow.
Right. If they say we're going to cut off 90% of the charges, if the hospital charges instead of charging $10,000, charges $100,000, well, the insurance company still saves you that 90%, but now they're 10%. They're getting that other 10%, right? And so they actually get more because they're also getting more premiums out of you. And so for them, they actually make more money the more the charges go up. And when I talked to Keith Smith, who runs a surgery center in Oklahoma.
Yeah, great guy. He's been on the show before.
Yeah. And so I remember going to a conference here in Michigan where he talked about that. And it never made any sense to me because he would go to these insurance companies and say, well, just come to me. I charge less than the hospitals because you want to save money. But they don't, because their incentive is to increase the premiums, is to they make money when you spend money. And in many cases now, they're insurance companies that are owned in part by healthcare systems. We have University of Michigan, they have their own healthcare system, and they have their own insurance programs, right? So you have an extra sort of weird sort of incentive for controlling costs, right? You have one side that supposedly wants them low and one side wants them high. Well, that clearly they can't possibly both be successful when they're sort of working together. So that I've learned. The bigger thing too for me, and this is something that very few people know if you're not actually in medicine. If you're in medicine, you absolutely are aware of this, and it's super frustrating. But there's a gigantic shortage of medications in this country, of generic medications. And this is the thing that was the most interesting episode I had, which is episode 5, where we talked about group purchasing organizations. And so if you think about hospitals at one time, they were very small charity organizations. Your Sisters of the Poor, they put together in 1910 or 1920, they built a hospital in your town. They did not build, $80 million structures with huge healthcare systems attached to it. They're very small and charitable organizations. So they didn't have any money and they had no administrative force. I mean, they were run by a couple nurses and a couple doctors who sort of had many privileges they provide to other local doctors. So for them to get group purchasing, to get bulk discounts for supplies like bedpans and syringes and needles, whatever hospitals needed at that time, sheets, they formed these co-ops and contracted with them to provide hospital supplies, which made a lot of sense because, if you have 30 hospitals that kind of join together, they can get better prices. And so that's a way for them to control costs. Well, healthcare changed obviously through the 80s and 70s as things consolidated many ways because of government intervention through Medicare and the CMS, Center for Medicare Services. But anyway, when they got bigger, Congress passed a law in 1987 called the Safe Harbor Act, where they allowed these group purchasing organizations and pharmacy benefit managers, and those are the companies that write contracts for the pharmacies. So the two parts there's one for the hospitals, one for the pharmacies. So these group purchasing organizations right now control about 90% of all the supplies you get into the hospitals. And so if you are a medication producer, like let's say you make lidocaine, which is a common local anesthetic you use for, numbing someone up, you have to get into the formulary of these group purchasing organizations. And with the congressional law in 1987, you had to pay membership to these group purchasing organizations to get your medication allowed by them. Well, that's all fine and good, except that this group purchasing organization would continue to jack up the prices. On the other end, they provide rebates. I'll use air quotes here for those who can't. I'll tell you for those who can't see, to the hospitals for using all the things on their formulary. So as long as you don't buy outside the formulary, right? So what happens over time is, this is 1987. we did not have significant drug shortage until mid 2000s, maybe 2008, 2009, they started showing up. Now it's a huge problem because what's happened is I used to be an innovative pharmaceutical company, and I did really good job making lidocaine, this local anesthetic. But now it costs, say, $20 million. I'm making up numbers. I don't really know the amount. Say $20 million to be on this formulary. Well, I can't, that margin for a generic like lidocaine, I can't make it in just one medication. So now I need at least two. And eventually you get to the point where you need at least 50 medicines or something to actually be able to get into this. So of course it narrows down the market to where now very few people can actually work at that scale. Right. And so this is right. And so what happens then, there's a fire or there's a hurricane or something happens. The FDA comes in and said, you've got rats running around your lab. So we're shutting you down. And now there's no flexibility. There's no slack in the market. Like normally, if there's a hurricane that rips through a toothpaste factory in San Juan, no one notices because there are 2,700 other toothpaste factories in the country. But that's not the case in medicine. I mean, that's obviously partially because the FDA and their regulations as far as, who can make it and, all those rules for production. But in many ways, it's because of these group purchasing organizations, which don't make anything. They don't produce anything. I mean, they don't distribute anything. They don't warehouse anything. They just write contracts. And they make money from the hospitals. They make it from basically people paying to play. And so what happens now is something happens like the hurricane that hit San Juan, and we suddenly have no normal saline in the country. Normal saline is sodium chloride and water. And we suddenly had a massive shortage for months in this country that we didn't have ability to give anyone regular IV fluids. They come in dehydrated.
So these groups have basically just cartelized the drug industry in so many ways. It's interesting because I've done probably 7 or 8 shows with doctors about various different topics about government intervention and how it affects various different aspects of the industry. This is the first time I've heard about these groups. So there's always different little aspects of things that we can find and say, oh, and there's this too. I mean, there's just so many different factors out there that are continuing to cause the cartelization of the medical industry in so many ways. And that is what all combined causes all these prices on everything to go up, whether it's medical devices, drugs, medical services, hospital stays, I mean, everything. And then that's not even getting back into the fact that these hospitals and stuff then go ahead and jack up the prices because they end up making more money that way. It's really just a mess of a system. And I know we're not going to all solve it in one podcast, but Dr. Larson, if there's, I mean, where would we start here? Like, if you became somehow, I don't know, Ron Paul runs for president in 2020 and becomes president and wants to make you the head of the FDA. Like, are there any things that could actually be done if the right person was in there that could at least bring a little bit of sanity back to the situation, scale things back in a certain way so we can start to get some semblance of a free market again? I mean, are there some small steps, realistic steps that you see that could be taken in the short term if there was at least enough of a movement behind it?
So you said small steps and realistic. So those are totally different things, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So, I mean, what you're asking really is like, if you could do whatever you wanted and you had no political repercussions and you could right, correct, what would you do to fix the system? Well, there are a lot of things you could do that are pretty simple. You could eliminate the Safe Harbor Act or whatever. And so then you allow other competitors into the market. It takes some time to have new manufacturers. You loosen up the FDA's regulations. Most of what they do is not very helpful. I had Mary Ruwart on a show, and we kind of went through the FDA problems. They rarely help prevent any disease. They cause the prices to be much higher for pharmaceuticals and cause the shortages, which really costs lives when you have limited access to, say, chemotherapeutic agents, things like that. So you can scale back that significantly. I mean, most of these agencies, I feel like, in many ways, you could try and reform them, but you almost in many ways need to just eliminate lots of them or many of their functions because, you can change the person at the head of the EPA, but the EPA essentially is going to have the same people working at the EPA, right? These people have been bureaucrats right there for 30 years or their entire career or whatever.
As with anything, it's really the overall culture that needs to change, and the culture, it's got to start with the people that send people to office that then make those decisions. You really need to get a sea change of ideas to really get things going.
I mean, I think ultimately what you need to do, I mean, in medicine, what you need to really do, first and foremost, that will solve many of the problems is just have patients pay for their care. Whether that's through HSAs, whether that's through direct primary care, whether that's through, I talked to a guy about the next episodes on crypto medicine, which is really interesting, but kind of hard for me to comprehend. but you have to have some other way of where you have real price signals within the market. So you have both players paying attention to costs. If that happens, then people are going to say, well, why is it this much? Right. I mean, because right now they're so far removed, they don't know any way to fix it. And they don't even know they just know their premium is really expensive. And they know they shop around, the premium's the same everywhere they go. No one can go in. I mean, by law, I'm not allowed to charge less for some people versus others. I mean, my rate has to be the same no matter who I talk to. Additionally, if I'm really good or really bad, I get paid exactly the same.
That's crazy that you can't even necessarily offer discounts to, let's say, if you wanted to create a pool of patients that were sort of on a smaller income scale and charge them differently, you couldn't even do that.
And I want to be clear, if you accept government payers like Medicare, Medicaid, you can't do this. They do allow a cash discount at time of service, but outside of that, everyone has to get paid, which it makes sense from CMS's standpoint because they want to make sure they're not getting hosed and having, you're offering these discounts to all these other people, and yet you're charging them the full amount. Now their full amount, of course, is about 30% of commercial payers. So the whole insurance system is really messed up. I mean, I think if you could somehow scale that back and go back to what it was like, the 1950s. I mean, clearly medicine was different in other ways then as well, but where because then you're having discerning customers, patients who are going to say, is it really important to do this? Where's the best place for me to get this lab work done? Because they're going to be worried about things like not just convenience, but also cost. I can tell you as someone who switched to an HSA, which is a health savings account this last year, much different in our purchasing pattern. And I'm pretty libertarian, right? So I'm always paying attention to cost, but now I'm much more sensitive to it. So I'm willing to drive an extra 2 miles to a different pharmacy to save myself $100 on a medication, because they seem totally random as far as which, this pharmacy is 160, this other one's 60 for the same medication. And and the next time the next medicine will be the opposite way. So I need my other prescription sent to a different pharmacy. But you're just, those things make you think twice about, how important is it to get whatever. I think medicine is important, but I need to make sure, save money. So there's no question that HSAs are a good idea, but you need to do more than that. And so, but that is a way of introducing sort of a market forces. But right now we only have 3% of people in the United States on HSAs. So that's not enough to make a significant dent in the healthcare costs. But, that expanding HSAs, making healthcare, maybe you give tax credits to everybody for buying healthcare. I don't know. I mean, that's right now it's just through your employer. So at least you remove the employer part of the healthcare. There are a lot of things you could do. I mean, obviously Republicans haven't been serious about it. I talked to Justin Amash in my third episode about it. And he's kind of like, no one in DC is really serious about these things. He has his ideas, but no one really wants to. They were never serious, right? I mean, sort of like I remember this is when I got first disillusioned with Republicans while I was in college. Excuse me, in mid-90s when Newt Gingrich took over and the Republican Revolution in the mid-90s, and they finally took back the House since the first time in 1950. All right, things are going to change. We're going to reduce the deficit. We're going to cut spending, and none of that happened. I mean, they did some welfare reform, which was good, and that was kind of the extent of it. And so it suddenly became, once we're in power, well, the reason we didn't do it is because we didn't have the Senate. And then, we didn't have the presidency. Oh, we don't have the Supreme Court, right? So they never get enough power in order to implement what they were never going to implement to begin with. And so that's the frustration that Republicans, I think, in many ways are waking up to. But
Well, yeah, the major parties stay in power via the rhetoric. They stay in power by being able to complain about the same things that the other side is either doing or going to do in the devastating world that will come about if you don't continue to vote for them. They don't maintain power through actually acting on their supposed principles. So I think, to me, that's what sets, and I'm using small L here, that's what just sets libertarians in general apart, is that we actually do have sort of a guiding philosophy and at least attempt to try to sort of stay the course with it. So, Dr. Larson, I'm very glad that you're out there as a voice, even though you don't label The Paradox a libertarian doctor podcast. I think anytime that those ideas are seeping in, and it's probably better that you don't, actually, because you're probably able to reach more people in the medical community that aren't going to be turned off by some sort of political label, but you're still able to work a lot of those ideas in there. So I'm glad you're out there doing what you're doing. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Before I let you go, why don't you just give a little roundup of how people can find more information about yourself and, of course, how they can find the Paradox podcast and everything else you got going on. If there is any other projects in the work, feel free to plug away.
Well, I don't have any other projects aside from just trying to get this thing going. We've had quite a bit of success with the podcast. I'm not exactly sure what successful is. I'm beyond the median for downloads, so I guess that's something.
If you've got more than 7 episodes, you're already doing better than half of them. So
right. And I've gone past the 7-episode hurdle, which they said, so I'm at 14.
All right. Well, welcome to the club then. You're a professional now.
Yeah, I'm not going to quit my day job, but it's been a lot of fun. I would recommend anyone to come by. It's not designed for physicians. The show is for physicians to better understand the problems they face in the trenches of medicine, but it's also designed for a way for physicians to provide this show, certain episodes especially, to their friends, families, and colleagues to help them understand. Because I think if there's one thing I think I'm pretty good at is being able to distill somewhat complicated issues that will, or sometimes technical, into some way that a layperson can understand. And so when we talk about drug shortages, we walk through and so you understand, and you'll be the smartest person on the block when it comes to drug shortages and why your grandmother couldn't get that chemotherapeutic agent, right? So those are the things that I'm looking to do, and I think we've been pretty successful. So if anyone wants to find out more, there's obviously a Facebook page at The Paradox. And again, it's The Paradox, is Paradocs. I'm on Twitter at Paradox. And then the website's the easiest way to find it is The Paradox, is TheParadocs.com. And you can find out more, sign up for the email list, and then find the episodes. And you can certainly find the podcast is streaming all over the place. It's also on YouTube now. I found my podcast converter automatically put it to YouTube if I wanted to. So that made it pretty simple. So it's on YouTube now if you like to stare at the picture of my logo and then listen to me. So however you like to get the show.
I'm always amazed. We put our podcast on YouTube too, and I figured no one cares. And every once in a while, I meet people that are like, "Oh, I'm so glad you put them up on YouTube. It's the only way I listen to things." I'm like, "Okay, all right. I don't know why you do, but okay, that's why we do it." So.
I'm thinking, what should I have video or something? But that's really complicated. And it's the hardest thing I found with the show is to try and get 2 doctors' schedules who generally have families and busy practices and stuff to try and coordinate for 1 hour a week is actually really, really
it's got to be a task.
And so that's actually been the hardest part about the show. But it's, I have lots of late night interviews and weird times. But again, it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, which I think anyone who's been in education, whether it's medical students or, college or high school, whatever, you end up learning far more than you end up teaching. And so I think that's, I found that in the show. I've learned a lot more than I thought I was going to. I thought I was going to be spewing information, and I've really been probably more of a sponge, which is, I think, the way it should be.
Absolutely. I mean, I started this podcast almost 5 years ago because I wanted people to learn more about the ideas of liberty and learn more about different viewpoints. But really, I think I've done the most learning this whole time in so many different ways, not just about the philosophy itself, about the Libertarian Party, about the political aspects, about persuasion, how to speak to people differently. I definitely speak about things much, much differently than I did 5 years ago. So there's so much you can learn just by doing a podcast, just by bringing on other people and having these conversations. So to me, that's really been the best part for myself. I'm glad it seems to be as well for you. So Dr. Larson, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. We will definitely be in touch, and keep up the great work. And of course, keep on roaring.
Thanks a lot, Marc. Appreciate it.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed my conversation as much as I did with Dr. Eric Larson. And please do check out the Paradox podcast, as well as my man Zach Kincaid and his song No More. Be sure to head over to rotgutcountry.com/roar for that free download of the acoustic version of that great anti-war country song. And before I wrap up here, all I want to really do is remind you, if you're new to this program, or just tell you, I guess if you're new for the first time, that we are a variety show here. We are the only libertarian variety show out there. We have 3 shows per week, soon to be 4 when we do the Candidates of Liberty show, which is coming in mid-August. But as of now, you can find, of course, myself here every single Monday hosting interviews like the one you hear today, and great roundtable discussions, such as libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor. You're also going to hear Brian McWilliams every single Wednesday with his weekly shot of comedy, culture, and liberty on Electric Liberty Land, as well as my man, John Odie Odermatt, wrapping things up every week on Fridays with his hard-hitting look at the broken criminal justice system on Felony Friday. And of course, like I said, coming soon, we don't have an exact date yet, but sometime in mid-August, we will see the debut of Candidates for Liberty, featuring short interviews with libertarian candidates all across the globe. If you are a candidate or have a candidate, again, even doing this, we probably won't be able to get everyone in, I'll be perfectly honest, but please do reach out anyway. Marc, M-A-R-C, at lionsofliberty.com. That's the best place to send your suggestions for candidates to be interviewed. We already have a very, very, very long list, so we're going to do our best to get to as many of you as we can before November. So please do reach out, though. We'll try to at least give you a mention, if nothing else. And I think I can now reveal who my first guest will be. My first guest will be Laura Ebke, who recently switched from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party and is up for re-election in Nebraska State House. So that should be a great interview. I'm really looking forward to speaking with her. Until next time, folks, live long and live free.